Thank you, Jeannie and David and Jeannie, for that really over-the-top introduction, and I'm just so honored to be here. You know, I can't think of anything more important in our communities than to talk about giving, and I'm going to be talking about finding our voices, partly because Kyung Yoon and Jeannie Park asked me to be here, and of course, those of you who know them know that you can't answer no to anything that they might ask you, but also because they are rock stars, and they know as journalists, as I do also as a former journalist, that we have to do this because nobody else will, because we have to tell our stories, because nobody knows our stories. And actually, what I'm going to talk about a little bit is nobody cares unless we make it so. And that's what Kyung and Jeannie and all of you are doing here today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about finding our voices and what that means to our communities. And you know, when I was a kid, so I want to talk about just having no visibility, being invisible, which is, you know, even at my age, I mean, when I was a child, I remember that very clearly just that there were never any Asian American Pacific Islander faces on television, in the news, in the media, anywhere, except in Hollywood movies or some TV shows where the enemy would show up, and that enemy would be the enemy to kill. And the enemy would have a face that referred to wars that were in Japan, in Korea, with China, Vietnam, and they always had an East Asian face. And so when I was a kid going to the movies, you know, with all the other kids, you know, for the matinee, there would be that defining moment in those war movies where, you know, the American heroes come in, who of course none of which were Asian, but the whole theater would rise up and say, "Kill them, kill them, kill them." And of course, when the lights came on, it would be somebody who looked like me or my brothers. And so we were really, truly invisible throughout American society in those days, unless we lived in ghettos with names like Chinatown, Koreatown, Little Tokyo, Little Manila, India town, or if we lived in Hawaii. Otherwise, if you grew up in a place like New Jersey, like I did, by the way, anybody else here from New Jersey? I always like meeting people who aren't ashamed to admit they're from New Jersey. But it wasn't just that feeling of being invisible or like being an alien. How we were viewed too. And I want to say, when I grew up, it was a time of the civil rights movement, and every high school, college at that time was had so much activism going on, and people would walk out of high schools, like my high school, John F. Kennedy High School, and would stop and say, we should have a teach-in. We should have a teach-in to talk about race in America and how to change that and make a world really where we can all be viewed by the content of our character. And so on one of those walkout days, you know, I went out with two school friends who I'd known a long time. One was black and the other was white. And as we all three stood there talking about the world we would like to see, one of my friends turned to me and said, "Helen, you know, you have to decide whether you're black or white." And now this was in the 1960s, granted, the words Asian American hadn't really come together yet, but I stood there thinking, well, how am I going to do that? You know, I'm not black and I'm not white, but the real message was that if you're not, you really don't have a voice. And I have to say, it shut me down. I really felt that I had nothing to contribute to that conversation anymore, which in the 20th century, and one could argue in the 21st century as well, is the color line is the issue for America. And so to be an Asian American kid then, and to have no voice in one of the biggest issues of the century was really, well, where do we fit? And how do we interject ourselves into this democracy that we are very much a part of? So I could give lots of other examples of invisibility, but I just want to share one with this group, with Korean American Community Foundation, and that's to remember 1992 Los Angeles. The Los Angeles riots, or the Los Angeles civil unrest, however you want to call it, but I don't have to say the details of that, you know, 2,500 businesses and homes were burned down. It really was the destruction of an entire immigrant neighborhood. And what I want to say about the invisibility there is that those of us who watched how the news covered 1992 Los Angeles, which also spread to places like New York, where people were just ripped apart on what was going on and what gave rise to the riots in Los Angeles, was that the one news program that everybody watched, if you cared about the news, I mean, it wasn't today where there's 24/7 news on, you know, countless stations and streaming. The one program was Nightline. It was, you know, 11:30 at night. It was the summary of the day's news. It was the analysis of the news. And after Sa-i-gu, 4/29, 1992, Nightline had coverage constantly, you know, every night about Los Angeles. And for the first week, for the first 10 days, they had no Asian Americans, no Korean Americans at all to talk about an opinion about what had happened. And it wasn't until almost 2 weeks that they invited one Korean American to appear on that program, and that was Angela Oh, an attorney from LA who did an amazing job. But just imagine being the one voice for an entire community that had been destroyed. And it didn't stop there. Then the LA Times, you know, the newspaper of record for Los Angeles, did a survey, a poll of all of its readers, and when they showed the results of the poll, it was the opinions of white, black, Latino, and other. Not even thinking to poll Korean Americans or Asian Americans on such a, you know, really global event. And because of the Asian American Journalists Association, the editor of the Los Angeles Times was invited to attend the AAJA, the Asian American Journalists Association conference, and he said, well, Asian Americans are not statistically significant in Los Angeles. Well, you know, in LA in 1992, the Asian American population was 11%. It was actually greater than the population of African Americans at the time. And what he really meant by saying Asian Americans are not statistically significant is that Asian Americans are not significant. And that was part of the invisibility, and where we go when we are not in control of saying who we are and what our communities are and the true humanity that we have. And it didn't stop there. 1992, fast forward to 2002, NPR did a retrospective 10 years after the LA insurrection. They didn't even mention Koreatown or interview anybody who was Korean American or Asian American for that matter. And you would think that would be bad enough. But then 20 years later, 2012, I'm an NPR listener, and once again, with the 20 years after what happened to Koreatown, still no Korean American voices. Now, there are many, many other historic examples that could be given here. I just wanted to show that one because it was so egregious and so much in our public minds, in our community, you know, our DNA as one of the major incidents that affected our communities. But even 20 years later, to not be part, what happens is we become what I call MIH, missing in history. And nobody's going to write our history except us. Nobody's going to tell our histories except us. And so, you know, I don't have to tell this group that is so focused on the needs and concerns of our various Korean American and Asian American communities. But even the little thumbnails about what happened in a Koreatown goes way beyond saying, 2,500 homes and businesses, several billions of dollars gone up in smoke. And it's not the money, it's the lives, it's the building, it's the blood, sweat, and tears that went to create a home and a neighborhood. And it's the aftermath. The aftermath that is about need. It's about the mental health of people. It's about food and clothing and what to do when your entire livelihood is destroyed. And so that's what the story is that we needed to talk about. And as I was writing and thinking, how is this book going to end, I realized, really the stories that I was hearing from 80-year-old people who were telling me stories that happened to them 60 and 70 years ago are really the stories of migration, about loss, about deciding which children you leave behind and which you take because you can't bring them all, about leaving your elderly parents behind, about sending 3 kids to 3 different countries because you think one of them might live. And the whole idea of what makes people leave a city like New York City, like Shanghai, where everything you know and everything you value and everything you built, why would you leave that? What would make you do that? And in looking at these stories, it's really clear. The only reason people the main reason people do this is because they think they're not going to survive. More important, they think their children are not going to survive. And that's why people today walk 1,000 miles with their babies in their arms, not knowing whether they're going to get tear gassed at the end of that journey and have their children ripped from their arms, or why they load up their whole family on a rubber raft and put them into the rough seas of the Mediterranean, traveling there from Syria or Somalia, and nobody can swim. Why do they do that? And to think, even looking at the news today, that Congress is incentivizing people to leave their countries and come here. That's not why they leave. And so part of the writing and the telling of our stories and making our stories visible is not just to tell our stories, but it's also to connect our stories to the real life situations and the issues that are affecting the lives of everyone around us, and to make those, to connect the dots, I guess, is that. And so, I just want to say for this gathering, this Giving Summit, giving our voices is part of that giving too. Finding a way to give stories of who we are and make ourselves visible. And whether we do it, we don't have to do it as we're not all writers, we're not all filmmakers, but you know what? It's the organizations we support, the people on the ground, the people and the organizations that the Korean American Community Foundation or any of the work we do, that's part of getting our stories told and making them real. So I just wanted to also say that, the donating money or giving our time is also part of the resources that help tell our stories, right? And that includes our social networks, the time we give, the people in our families we tell about, what we learned at a gathering like this today. And these are ways also of bringing our communities out of invisibility. These are investments in our communities and in our futures. And while I am really so heartened to see so many Asian names on buildings today, on college campuses, or faces on corporate boards or community boards, I've often heard the stories too of on say a campus in New York State that received $20 million to build a building, and now it has the name of an Asian name on it. The students on that college campus have been fighting for years, for decades, for Asian American studies, for programs, for a course or two, and a professor, somebody to teach this history that's so MIH, missing in history. But what happens is people not using the tools that they have to also get a result. And so a $20 million grant to a school to build a building without even realizing that there are Asian American history that's missing and students are fighting for that. I can give you about 5 different schools where I've seen this happen and completely disconnected from the actual needs there. But and why is that? I think this is also a part of the invisibility. People are so grateful to be recognized. Oh, you're coming to me to ask for my money. Oh, and you'll put my parents' names on your building? Okay, great. And then I've heard from other fundraisers who say that why is it that the Asian American community never asks for anything in return? Every other community does. You know, whether it's politicians or, symphony or opera, ballet. They ask for things from the Asian community but not have any requests made. And it doesn't have to be tit for tat to say this, but just to express that I am so happy to give my whatever the amount. And, I'm really interested in this. And just to express that I've heard that the students on your college campus have been fighting for 3 decades to have a few courses on Asian American history. And, just let them know we don't do that. And that, I think, is also a result of not telling our stories, not being seen, not being heard. And when my mother passed away a year and a half ago, and we were cleaning out her things, we found lots of little notebooks that I had no idea were there. Some of them listed every penny my mother ever earned, got, received. It listed for years the money that my siblings and I had given to help my parents out. Can you imagine finding your name and the money you had given out, and then comparing it to your siblings? I mean, we were all looking. We didn't say anything, but it was like, wow. But this was how much care my mother, and I think every immigrant has, because they worked so hard for that money. She accounted for every penny. And shouldn't we also be accounting for every penny and seeing what it is we can do for our communities to make that investment count? That's what that notebook, one of the things that notebook taught me. And there was a whole other set of little notebooks where my mother had, in her very careful handwriting, lists of words, vocabulary words in English in Chinese, what the definitions were. Things like, how are you today? Or what's happening? Things like that, She would have these expressions in there. And some of those notebooks were up until she was very frail. And what that taught me was, she cared about learning, and her English was not really strong. She couldn't read very well, and yet she wanted to make sure she learned even up until the day she was almost dying. And it was that much she wanted. And, I think about all of us who are so privileged to have an education, the kind of education that my mother didn't have because she had been an abandoned girl when she was 6. For those of us who don't have to struggle through war or chaos or economic turmoil, or to have to flee from a place for our lives. And, we can use our voices. We have that privilege, and so why don't we, as much as we can, whether it's our time, our volunteerism, our financial or social resources, or whatever voice we have, why wouldn't we, right? And so if we can make a difference using any of those tools and using our voices to just move our communities ahead in some way to support the real needs that they have that nobody else recognizes because they are so invisible and so voiceless, why wouldn't we do that? And so I know these are very trying times. There's a whole generation of America, of society, of people of Asian Americans who have never known a society before 9/11. and have only known this world to be fractured and for people not to work together. And so part of our telling of these stories is to show that actually the Asian American community has has more than 100 years of stories of people coming together to do things, whether as in a multiracial way or cross-class or across ethnicities, despite war in Asia. And so we have lots of stories to tell that would be inspirational, especially to a next generation. And that next generation, I have to say, I do worry about this invisibility. I actually did some interviewing for multi-generational Asians. By that I mean third generation Asian Americans, third generation, fourth generation to this society. Well, we have, among Asian America, people who are 10th generation Asian Americans, and they know it. And I actually went and interviewed some of them and asked them, well, what is it about being Asian that makes you, connect? And one of them looked and said, well, I can use chopsticks, and okay, so can a lot of people. And another said, I like adobo, and Filipino American, 10th generation. And the fact that he liked adobo was his connection. And another one said, well, I'm good at math. And there are a lot of Asian Americans we know who are not so good at math. Does that make them less? But, so here's what I drew from that. When they do these surveys of kids and ask them, do you know, who can you name who's Asian American? The one name that gets raised, and just about the only one, is Bruce Lee. Not Michelle Wee, not not Christy Yamaguchi, not any number of very prominent and well-known Asian Americans. So what? Bruce Lee, and he only got to be the sidekick forever until he went to Hong Kong to make his own films. And so that's part of our telling our stories too. I mean, what are we going to do for a generation? And the next generations, are that they only going to think that they are Asian because of the stereotypes of being good at math or through some food? And our stories, our voices, are American stories that everybody should hear. And so I guess I just want to end with saying, time will change. And I didn't mean this to be, to say, look, we have to talk about our victimhood. No, not at all. We have to tell this full story of our full humanity. What gives us joy? What makes our families happy? What makes people sing? And I've been told that the songs that make Asian people happy are somewhat different from European. Well, okay, we know those songs too, but people should know our songs and our joys. And that's part of finding our voices and getting away from this invisibility and voicelessness and really making a change, because within a decade or two, but I actually think more of a decade, the population we know of the United States is going to change. There's going to be no majority race. Demographers say that's going to happen in 2042. I actually think it will be much sooner than that. California passed that milestone 20 years ago, and 10 other states have passed that too. What is it going to look like? What is it going to mean for this generation that has only known life after 9/11, who are going to be in a position of leadership to figure out where they fit? Where do Asian American voices fit when the whole country is going to be different? Is it just the deck chairs on the Titanic are going to change? There's going to be a different group in play, or are we going to be able to present who we are and who our communities are in a real way, not as defined by other people? So I would just like to leave with that challenge. And we talked earlier about being at the table, and I just wanted to share what my spouse, Leah, says about that. She says, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And to remember that, we have to not only be at the table, our voices have to be out there, our visibility has to be out there, and to take another paraphrase instead of Leah. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, he, we know, has said, the arc of history is long, but it will bend toward justice. Well, it will bend if we help make it bend.